Hi, everybody. It's Mr. Allsip coming to you again from the amazingly warm living room studio. I'm going to apologize if you hear any birds in the background. That is because my windows are open because it is way too warm in the living room studio for me not to have windows open right now during the summertime. So it's great. We've seen some really nice weather coming on here. And so I'm really excited to be outside and doing science in the out of doors, which is a lot more fun sometimes than doing it in indoors. So nature walks and things like that are great around this time of year to go out and see what's growing and what's happening outside. And of course, when we talk about science, we're always thinking about the observation part of science, where a lot of scientists, the very first thing that they do is they observe something out there that makes them think about, well, why does that happen? Or, what could be a reason for that? And so those are the kinds of things that we get when we get outside and we start looking around and seeing what's out there. So really exciting time of year, really exciting to get out there and do some stuff. Today, I promised last week we would talk a little bit about buoyancy. So we're going to try to talk a little bit about buoyancy, but I'm going to warn you that buoyancy sometimes kind of moves into some other topics, and they get kind of interesting. And so we're going to be jumping around a little bit here and there. So bear with me a little. So the basic question behind buoyancy is, why do things float even if they're very heavy or very dense? And we learned last week that density partially controls whether or not something sinks or floats when you drop it into a liquid. And so, for example, things like certain types of metals, especially iron and steel, when you drop them into water, they sink almost immediately. Whereas certain types of wood will float on the surface of water, like pine. So those things float because of density, or they sink because of density. But you may have also noticed that there are things out there like aircraft carriers and stuff like that that are enormous and are made out of steel. And so they should sink, but they don't. So buoyancy is really related back to Newton's third law. And we all remember Newton's third law, right? Newton's third law says that to every action, there is an equal and an opposite reaction. Now, we can think of this in a lot of different ways. A lot of people remember this particular law because when they think about it, it makes them really think about relationships and how they act around people. It's the formation of the golden rule, that thing you learn about in ELA class when you start talking about how doing right by others is the right thing to do. And so when we think about that, we want to treat other people the way we would like to be treated. And there's this idea that if we put a lot of negative things out there into the world, a lot of negative things come right back at us. And so we think about that. And in physics, it actually really is true with the motion of objects that for every action that's going on out there, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Now, one of my favorite examples for this comes from my youth. I grew up here in the North Country. I grew up way in northern New York, up near Messina and Potsdam area. And in the wintertime up there, when I grew up, it was a long time ago. You can probably tell because of all of the, well, some of the white hair and some of the no hair. But I'm old and I've been around a long time. And when I was growing up, there was no such thing as the internet, no video games, which is obviously terrible. There was very little even television when I was growing up. Most of my television actually came from Canada, and most of it was in French. And so there wasn't a whole lot of stuff to do indoors. And so we spent a lot of time outside. And that brings me to this really great example of Newton's third law. For us, one of the things that we did a lot was we would go outside in the winter, and we had a skating rink in our town. We basically had a little hockey rink. It was outside. It was not amazingly well maintained. We actually would go out in the fall and we would scrape up all the leaves and stuff like that before we would flood it in the winter. But we had a little hockey rink and we could get out there on our skates and we could skate around. One of our favorite games to play was this one. And this is a game where you stand on your skates And what you do is you stand with your two skates so that they're right side by side with each other, so that both of your skates are pointed in the same direction. And then you put your hands up against someone else's hands that are standing in front of you. And what you try to do is you try to see if you can make the other person fall down. Now, every little kid, when you first teach them this game, the first thing they try to do is push as hard as they can. And when you push as hard as you can against someone who is on skates, what happens is that person just moves backwards and you move forward. And particularly the top part of your body moves forward while the bottom part of your body moves backwards. So what ends up happening is you fall when you push really hard like that against someone on skates. And the other person just slides backwards because they're just keeping their hands steady. And so as you push on them, you're pushing forward with the top part of your body. The bottom part of your body, equal and opposite reaction, moves backwards. And so it creates this really fun game where you can stand there for a long time with someone where when someone tries to push, you pull your hands back. And when you try to pull your hands back, that other person tries to kind of move into that space. And so you stand there for a really long time trying to figure out who's going to push first and who can react the fastest. And sometimes if you can get in a good push, you can knock the other person down. But most of the time it's because the other person's trying to push too hard and you're, going to let them push themselves over. So really fun game from my youth. Makes me think a lot about that idea of every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. If I push on something, it is going to have a reaction for me. I am going to move. One of the other great examples I have also comes from when I was a kid. Remember, no internet. We didn't have a whole lot of ways to amuse ourselves. One of the other things we would do is during the summertime and even during the fall and during the spring, we would get together and we would go out to mountains. And we would go up to one of the mountains, and we live close to the Adirondacks, so there are mountains everywhere. And we would go out to a mountain, and my friends and I, who were all fairly athletic and liked to do, outdoorsy type of things, we would each have a little stopwatch that we had with us, or a regular watch that you could start and stop the time on. And what we would do is we would run as fast as we could up to the top of the mountain. So we would run and run and run and run, and obviously these are not the mountains we ran on because this is wintertime and these mountains are really high. The mountains we ran on, really realistically, we could probably call hills. But we would run as fast as we could up to the top of these small mountains, and we would get up to the top of the mountain, and when you got to the top of the mountain, you would stop your watch. And you would say, okay, I made it up the mountain in this amount of time. And you would figure out how much time it took you to get to the top of the mountain. And everyone would keep their time. They would hang on to those times so they would remember how long it took them to get to the top of the mountain. And then once everyone was up there and we made sure everyone was okay and we had a chance to take a break at the top of the mountain, get a little water, get ourselves ready to go again, then we would race back down the mountain. And you would keep the same time that you had when you got to the top, and you would just start your timer again as you ran down. And the goal was to see who could make it up and then back down in the shortest amount of time. So if you made it up really quickly, you could go slow and take your time and be more careful on the way down. But if you had taken a little slower route getting up, then when you were going down, you were trying to go as fast as you can. And the reason this makes me think about Newton's third law is one of the ways you would try to stop yourself going down the mountain to slow yourself down a little bit was you would deliberately run into a tree and just kind of grab a hold of the tree and try to slow yourself down so you wouldn't fall, because your upper body was kind of falling down the mountain while your lower body was trying to keep up by moving your legs as fast as you possibly could. And so by the time you got to the bottom of the mountain, you were moving fairly fast, and sometimes your feet couldn't keep up with the upper part of your body and you'd fall over. So grab a tree. Now the problem is the forces involved. If your force and the tree's force are equal, in other words, the tree is strong enough to actually survive a hit from you, what's going to happen typically is your motion is going to stop. That's what we would hope would happen for the person who's looking to slow themselves down with a tree, right? We're hoping that when we hit that tree, we're going to stop. But sometimes that tree, you might not know it, but might not have very deep roots. And so sometimes the force that the tree exerted back on you when you hit it wasn't equal to your force. Sometimes it was a lot less. And when that happened, the tree would just fall over. And now you're still flying down the hill and you've just plowed over a tree. And that's not great for the tree, and it's really not great for you, because the likelihood is you're probably going to go onto your face as you're falling down the hill. So you always want to choose a nice sturdy tree to grab onto. And of course, if the tree's force is greater than your force, then it stops you. If your force and the tree's force are equal, then sometimes it slows you down but doesn't stop you. And then of course, if your force is way greater than the tree's force, the tree will go down. And that essentially is the basis for a lot of physics reactions. That equal and opposite force when you hit something pushing back against you with an equal force that you pushed against it with. It's the same reason why we watch football a lot for those of us that are physicists and scientists, because we love watching those reactions in football and how things like that happen on a football field, because it's very similar to that. It all depends on how those reactions work with regards to which side of that action is stronger, the action side or the reaction side. So it is a pretty interesting thing. It also enables things like rockets. When we think about what a rocket does is it shoots gas out of the rear end of the rocket, which causes the front end of the rocket to move forward. So gas going out in one direction means the rocket moves in the opposite direction from the gas that's going out. We're really excited. I'm really excited anyway, because it's right now I'm taping this on Thursday, and the SpaceX launching a rocket just got postponed. So I'm really excited to see when we're going to do the rocket launch coming up, and I'm excited to watch that and see us launching people back into space again, because it's been a really long time, and we used to do it all the time when I was a kid, and now we don't do so much with space. So I'm really excited to see us taking back some of the lead in space and trying to get people out there again, get the space stuff moving. But all of that is made possible by Newton's third law. Those rockets don't need to push against anything. Just the motion of the gases coming out of the rocket makes the front part of the rocket go forward. And we're going to see another good example of that in a minute. But what we really have to do is kind of get back to that buoyancy idea. And buoyancy follows the same rule, and that is that as an object pushes down against the water pushes back up against the object. So when I put a piece of metal into water, it's going to push down on the water, and the water is going to push up against the metal. And now you have to ask yourself, well, which of those forces is stronger? Is the force of the metal pushing down stronger than the force of the water pushing up? And if it is, then it's going to sink. But if the water's force is stronger, then it's going to float. And really what it comes down to is the amount of weight of the fluid that the object moves as it pushes. So when an object goes into the water, it pushes an amount of fluid away that's actually equal to the volume of the object for the most part. And then you have to figure out, well, how much would that much water weigh? That's where when we think about things like a big aircraft carrier, we think, man, that aircraft carrier is pushing a lot of water out of the way. And that's going to result in a lot of pushing back from the water, pushing back up against the aircraft carrier. That's why certain boat designs work better than others. When you look at how boats are designed, some boats are designed with flat bottoms, some boats are designed in kind of a V shape. All of these different shapes that boats are designed in are designed to try to figure out how they can move as much water as possible, or as much fluid as possible. Because this works for fluids other than water. There are even some fluids, like for example mercury, which is actually a metal, which is fluid at room temperature and actually is incredibly heavy. And so anything that sits on it and displaces a little bit of it creates a massive force pushing back upwards. So it's very hard to get anything to sink in mercury. Mercury tends to push up too hard for anything to sink into it. So again, it's all about the amount of weight that the object moves as it pushes into the fluid, because all of that fluid pushes back up against the object. And so it makes that object float and kind of stay on top of that fluid. Now, there are a couple of other things happening here. Some of you may have heard of something called surface tension. Surface tension is the tendency for the top of a fluid to stick together, for the molecules there to not want to break apart from each other. That's how things like water striders are able to walk on top of water, even though they're not pushing down very much water when you think about it. They've got a really small point that they're actually interacting with the water on. But what they're relying on is that surface tension. That's a little of a different issue than what we're talking about with buoyancy and water pushing back up against something. But it's important to know there's a lot of different ways that things can float. So when we think about this, with a really big ship, there's really two things going on. One is the ship's moving a lot of fluid, and that fluid has a lot of weight, and that weight is now pushing back upwards against the ship. The other thing that we don't think about much, we think about the density of the metal that makes up the ship, right? The ship is made out of steel. Steel has a really, really high density, which means it's going to sink. But the ship doesn't sink. And the ship doesn't sink because the inside of the ship is not filled with metal. The inside of the ship is not made out of steel. The inside of the ship is filled with air for the most part. I mean, there's, some steel inside of there making up decks and things like that. And there's people in there and there's other things in there. And that explains why you can't put too much stuff on a ship. But the air that's trapped in there has such a low density that when you average the density of all of the metal in the ship, along with all of the air in the ship, it makes the ship's average density much, much less. So now the combination of the amount of fluid that it's moving and the pressure that that fluid can exert, combined with a lessening of the density from the ship because there's a lot of air trapped inside of there, means that a really big ship can still float, even though it weighs a lot, even though it takes up a lot of space, even though it has a really high density, it can still float up on top of the water. And like I said, it's these two things that make that possible. And to look at one and kind of get an idea, one of the types of boats that we look at a lot in this area are canoes. Canoes in this area have this great design where a canoe is designed with a very flat bottom to the boat. And that flat bottom means that it's pushing down a lot of water. When you think about boats that have that kind of V shape, that V shape makes them push into the water more, and it pushes away some of the water. But a flat shape like this is going to press just straight down against the top of the water, which does result in some water pushing back up. But most canoes have to be made out of something pretty light. There are some people that build canoes. For those of you that ever get a chance to go around some of the universities in northern New York, there are some people that go and do a competition where they try to build canoes out of cement. And that's really hard. It's a very tough engineering challenge to build a canoe out of cement. So most canoes are built out of really lightweight things, so they float easily. It's only when you really want to challenge yourself that you're going to try to build a canoe out of something as heavy as cement. But when you look at that canoe, in addition to all of the stuff pushing down with the canoe, you can also see just how much on the inside of that canoe is actually air. All of the stuff in the middle of the canoe, there's just nothing there. It's just all air. And so if you averaged out the density of all of the fiberglass or even the aluminum that the canoe is made out of, and then you averaged out the density of all of the air that's trapped inside of the canoe in the space that it's displacing the water, now the density of that canoe becomes really small. So small, in fact, that you can start adding stuff to that airspace that's fairly dense, like, me. I'm a fairly dense object. When you add me into that canoe, my weight is not enough to make the canoe sink. Now, it might make the canoe sit a little bit lower in the water, but it's not going to be enough to make that canoe just completely disappear, because it's all about the averages of the densities of everything in it and how much of each density you have. So when we look at canoes, they're really kind of one end of a spectrum. And going along with that, if we lived somewhere a little bit further south, we might be more accustomed to seeing boats that look like this. Now, this boat is something called a fan boat. And fan boats are very similar to canoes in that their bottom is very, very flat and they don't displace a ton of water, so they have to be made out of very light materials anyway. But the difference between a fan boat and a canoe is that in a canoe, when we want the canoe to move, what we do is we use a paddle, and we put our paddle into the water and we pull our paddle through the water to make the canoe move. What's happening there is the paddle edge, the flat part of the paddle, is actually pushing against the water. And according to Newton's third law, when we push against it, there's an opposite reaction. So now, as we push against the water pushes back against our paddle, which means that as we pull our paddle through the water, the canoe can move forward. Same kind of an idea. Now, this type of boat is very, very similar to that, except for rather than pushing against the water, this boat is just going to release air from the back of the boat. And it's going to do that by using a fan. And that fan is going to pull air from the front of the boat and push it out of the back of the boat. And the air moving out of the back of the boat is going to cause the boat to move forward. Just like the rockets that we were talking about. They exhaust a gas out of the bottom of the rocket and the rocket moves up. This boat is exhausting a gas, air, out of the backside of the boat. And what it's doing is it's causing the boat to move forward. So they are really cool boats, and they're really cool because they're using that idea of Newton's third law to propel the boat forward. Now, what I think is kind of fun is these are all principles that we can kind of play with at home. It's a really fun experiment to try out. Something that I recommend doing, and it's really a neat thing, if you can get somewhere where there's some water that you can play around with, you can build yourself a balloon boat. Now, the simplest way to do this is to get some aluminum foil from your kitchen. Only do this if you have extra aluminum foil. Make sure you talk to your parents first. Don't take the last of the aluminum foil. That doesn't go over really well. So you want to make sure that it's okay that you use the aluminum foil. And you need to find somewhere where there's a little bit of water, but that water is, number one, safe. And number two, not too windy or choppy. It shouldn't have any currents or anything like that, and it should just be flat, still water. My favorite thing to do this with is those little plastic pools that you buy for the summertime, and you put the plastic pool out in the backyard and you fill it up with your hose, and now you have this little pool in the backyard, the little kiddie plastic pools. Perfect for this. So if you have a little plastic pool at home, go ahead and put that out in the yard. The first part of this challenge is to build yourself a boat. And when you use the aluminum foil to build the boat, you can experiment a little bit with some different boat designs. Try some boats that look like canoes that have a really flat bottom and just rolled up a little bit at the edges. Try some boats that look more like a traditional boat with a big V-shaped thing and going all the way down. Try a bunch of different ideas. This is all about science. It's all about experimenting. There's no wrong way to build the boat. If the boat sinks, well, okay, you made a mistake, but you're going to learn something from that. You're going to go, when I build a boat like this, it sinks. Maybe I should try building it some other way and see if I can get it to float. So it's all about trying and being accepting of the fact that sometimes your boat's going to sink, but sometimes it's going to float. And when it floats, it's going to feel great that you built something that can float in that water. Now, once you have some boat designs, some boats that you've got that are set up and ready to go, the only other thing you really need to do this is a balloon and some tape. So if you can get a balloon, I know not everyone has balloons around the house, but maybe you can check and see if there are any around your house, or maybe you can have someone go and pick up some balloons. Balloons are perfect for this. You're going to take the balloon, you're going to blow it up, and then you're going to use tape, and you're going to tape your balloon to your boat. Now, don't just take a piece of tape and just put it right over the top of the balloon and think that you're going to hold the balloon down to the boat. That's probably not going to work so well. Usually what I do is a little tiny piece of tape on one part of the balloon and then stick that right to the inside of your boat where the people would normally sit. Now, when you do that and you have your balloon attached to your boat, the next thing you're going to do is you're going to blow your balloon up, okay? And when you get your balloon all blown up, then you're going to put your boat down in the water and you're going to let go of the end of your balloon. Now, we all know that when we do that, the balloon makes a really funny noise and then it starts to move away from us. Now, in a normal circumstance, that balloon is just going to go in random directions. We do this all the time at school when we're practicing stuff for physics. We blow up balloons and we let go of them and we see what directions they go in and see if there's any rhyme or reason to how they move. Spoiler alert, there really isn't. Balloons are just going to go anywhere unless they have something to guide them. And in this case, the guide is going to be your boat. So if your boat was built in a way that makes it have a direction that it's designed to move in, then when you release that balloon, your boat's going to move in that direction. And it's just going to zoom off in that direction and you can see how far it's going to go. This is where I say, try a few different ideas, because you might find that some of those ideas work better than others. And it might be really fun to see what kinds of ideas work better and what kind of ideas don't work so well. And my goal is always to try to see, can I build a boat that's going to go really, really far? So what's the farthest I can make my boat go? Can I make it go all the way across my little pool? Could I make it go across my pool and then catch it at the other side and turn it around and make it go back? All of these kinds of things are going to give you something fun to kind of experiment with and kind of have a little fun with out in the backyard, hopefully, now that it's nice and warm out. Again, have fun, keep going outside, keep trying to do some more science, and I will see you again next week.